When sewing shears, you want a seam that is thin and strong, and ideally you want something that looks the same from both sides. So this is my version of an overlap seam for shears. I'm using two different colors so that you can see how this all works. We have a lot to do, so let's get busy. To begin, I have drawn the stitching lines and cutting lines of our sample onto white paper. As you can see, we have the pink one here, we have the blue one here. I'm using two different colors, which will make it a little easier to understand how this process works. So I went over to the sewing machine and I stay stitched through the paper on the stitching lines. This helps you mark the fabric so you know the fabric is accurately marked. So this is the setup for our sample. Two different colors for the overlap seam. To begin sewing, I'm going to remove the seam allowance on this side. We want to clear this away. We don't want there to be any more paper than we need on here. So when you're stay stitching, you want to stay stitch short stitches, otherwise you're going to get a little something like this. So what I'm going to do here then is I'll just fold this back a little bit. We'll get it out of the way, and I will come in and overlap one stitching line on top of the other. Now, we don't have to remove the seam allowance yet on the other side. That will occur later. So we're pinning one on top of the other, and I will work off camera and finish and bring you back the results. So here you can see I have the two stitching lines pinned one on top of the other. The next step will be at the sewing machine. Now we want to make sure to stitch right on top of the stitching line. Better. Make sure that both lines sit one on top of the other. With transparent fabrics, that's easy to do. Okay, we back tack at the end. Now let me take the work out, show you the result. So there, the two lines are stitched one on top of the other. Our next stop is going to be the pressing table. So here we are, back from the machine. So before we do any pressing, what we want to do is turn the paper over like so, and we want to remove the paper from the blue side. There we go. And I'm going to just back this off a little bit, take this Beautiful. And fold this back. So we fold this back, we fold this back. So we have these two seam allowances. Now the seam allowances, let me just zoom in here a little bit. The seam allowances, as you can see, face, there we are, opposite directions. So they're going to go like this. So to begin, we're going to have the fabric side up, not the paper side up. And smooth out the other seam allowance here. A little bit fiddly with the paper, but it's still easier to manage. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we have the pink seam allowance from this side. We're going to press the pink seam allowance back on itself. Like so. So here we are at the machine, and as you can see, I pressed this layer back against itself. So we're going to put it under the foot and sew 1/8 of an inch. Back tack. Now, let me pull out and show you what we've done here. So you can see here, all of the seam allowances now sit to the right. We will fix that in the next step. So we pressed this seam allowance, the pink one, back against the pink, sewed at 1/8 of an inch. Next, I'll meet you back at the pressing table. So here we are back at the pressing table. So I'm going to flip this over. And now I will press the blue seam allowances back along the row of stitching that I just sewed. So now, as you can see, we have, here we are, we have the blue seam allowance folded back against the blue seam allowance, and the pink seam allowance folded back against the pink seam allowance. To give you a little explanation before I go and sew, you want a little more fabric caught in there than if you just put the two one side on top of the other and sewed. Having a little extra turn of fabric on both of those sides is going to make it stronger. So what I will do is I will go back to the machine and I will actually sew again along the original line of stitching. So back to the sewing machine. So what I will do is I will sew again along that line there. That's where we're going with this. So put the needle in the fabric. And again, back tack. Take the work out and show you the results. So here, that's what it looks like. And you can see here, there's one seam allowance here, there's one seam allowance here. Now at this point, for me, the paper is just going to cause more problems. So I'm going to go over to the work table and remove the paper, and I will bring back the work. Now this next step, I'll show you what we have again. This is one side and this is the other. So now you have to decide what the face side is at some point, but we'll get to that in a moment. So this next step I do more for security than anything. It's a serpentine stitch, and the width of this is 1.75 or 1.8, somewhere in there, and the stitch length is 0.75. It's a very short serpentine stitch. Zoom in a little bit here, bring this down a little so you can see where we're going. So what we're doing here we're really nailing these two together. See, ultimately these will hide under the satin stitch, which we're going to sew in a moment. So let me take the work out of the machine and give you a little long view of it. So this goes through all the layers. You can see here, and you can see here. The next step, finishing. Now finally, you are going to overcast this double row of stitching. So the stitch width is a zigzag. It is 3.8 to 4.0 millimeters. The stitch length is satin stitch. And you want to work slowly here. And the object also here is to keep tension this way so that the fabric lays flat. Now notice the foot I'm using. This is called an open toe embroidery foot. You know, I never understood why feet make a difference. This has something on it. The profile on the bottom makes a satin stitch work beautifully. Because the object here is the satin stitch is going to cover all of this. Now, since this is slow going, I'm going to go off camera and sew a little more, and I'll meet you back at the end of the seam. Okay, we are finished. Now let me show you the result. There you have it. Now, is that not beautiful? Now, something to know, if you balance your tension correctly, the seam looks the same pretty much from both sides. But there is one more step, trimming the seam allowances. We will go back to the work table for that. So here we have the seam. Here's one side, here's the other. Now we need to trim away all of these seam allowances. So that requires good scissors. I find I like a longer scissor rather than a shorter one. And you want the raw edges of the seam allowance to face your palm. So when you're trimming, you can control how close you get to the stitching by the tilt of the scissors. You see, I'm tilting the scissors very close. I can actually get a little closer. So you're going to run the scissors right along the stitches because you want to trim that seam allowance out really close to those stitches. And this is ticklish work because you don't want to nick the stitches. You want to get right next to them. And so yes, hold your breath when you do this. Okay, there we go. So now you can see, you just see a tiny, tiny little bit of that. In a moment, I'll show you a little trick to maybe get rid of some more of that. So let's turn this over. And now that you've trimmed one side, you want to trim the opposite side so that you no longer have these seam allowances. And again, just hold your breath. Take it slow and carefully. Because if you nick it, then you have to rip this out and start over, which I don't recommend you do. There we are. Phew. Okay. Ta-da! Now, so there is one side, and there is the other. Now, if you want to get rid of those little whiskers, I'm going to show you a little tool I use to do that. So, if you have little whiskers, you get this Remington shaver. That gets rid of any whiskers. And on this side, so you can see here, you have a little bit of fabric. You can give that a tug and trim that away. And again, so there you have it. Clean from both sides. So this is the front and the back. The overlap seam.